Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on diversity and critical thinking. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are very, very pleased and excited to be able to present for you today. This presentation builds on the key theme of diversity from the National FYE conference last year. The definition of student success has been expanded to include critical thinking and diversity as important student outcomes. We plan to spend about 30 minutes discussing key principles today, and then we will reserve 15 minutes at the end for Q&A discussion as well. We will be answering questions throughout the webinar if time allows. So if you have a question, please feel free to enter it in the chat function or in the Q&A, and we will address it as we are able. But I would love to introduce our wonderful presenters today. Dr. Marcia Freilich has been teaching college success courses for the last 43 years. She grew up in the Santa Fe area of New Mexico and has always realized the importance of helping students take pride in their culture and appreciating diversity. Her courses have always included a career and diversity component to help students be successful in college, careers, and beyond in their lives. She's the author of various textbooks on college and career success, including Native American and Hawaiian versions. Her college success program in the San Diego area has received many awards from students, faculty, and it was also designated as an exemplary program by the California Community Colleges Board of Governors. Research on the program has shown that a 20% increase in retention results from it, and an 80% success rate for students enrolled in her program also occurs. Dr. Seth Batiste is the new co-author of the 9th edition of College and Career Success, and he prides himself on helping students think critically and appreciate diversity. He experienced different cultures growing up, from his birth in Houston, Freedmanstown, where emancipated slaves settled, to living in East Austin and Houston's 5th Ward. Dr. Batiste attended one of the country's most diverse universities, the University of Houston, and was an upward bound college readiness director for low-income students on Houston's East End. He has worked on Lone Star Community College's Best Start Quality Enhancement Plan, which became the cornerstone of the college's educational frameworks course, addressing student success, and he has taught for over 15 years. He is currently CEO and Chief Strategist of Batiste Consulting, LLC. But without further ado, I will turn it over to our wonderful presenters. Dr. Freilich, Dr. Batiste, thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome, everyone. We appreciate your attending today and welcome any comments or questions you have as we present or at the end of our presentation. The resources that I'll be mentioning today are available on my website, College Success One, under Training Notes. This is what my homepage looks like, College Success One. Click on Training Notes. There you'll find links to some articles that I'll reference in the presentation, also links to classroom exercises that you can use in courses at your college. Here are some key ideas for this webinar. The first one is an educated person can think critically and view issues from different perspectives.
Also, student success includes an appreciation of diversity. It increases success in college, careers, and life.
These ideas are part of our teaching philosophy. We want to teach students to think critically and see different perspectives rather than advocating for a specific agenda. Civil discourse is important and emphasized from the first day of class.
Also, increase an appreciation for diversity through listening and communication rather than defending a position.
We'd like to know how many of you include diversity and critical thinking in your first year experience course or are considering adding this topic. Just type yes in the chat window if you include this topic or are considering adding it. And then Megan later on can report on how many people have replied yes.
I'm not sure I understand.
As I thought about the pandemic and the events of the past year, I thought about these important questions, especially how they would impact a first-year experience course. Maybe you recognize some of these questions and have thought about them yourself. For example, how can we reduce systemic racism?
And can we change people's minds?
How do we even know what's true?
How can we help students think more critically?
How can we engage students in meaningful discussions?
How can we increase college, career, and lifelong success?
And even, what is the future of our democracy?
And can we make the world a better place to live?
I'm sure you thought about these issues. Add your questions in the chat window as you think of them. We will address them as time allows.
We've got quite a few in the chat window saying that they do or are planning to include diversity elements in their class, which is wonderful.
That's good to hear. I think that's an up and coming topic. FYE talked about that extensively at their last conference. So I think that's a new emerging trend. As I've thought about the issues of racism, I've wondered how we could make progress on the issue. Can we even change people's minds? I read some interesting research on the topic and I've included them in the resources for this webinar. Here's an interesting idea. Don't try to change someone else's mind. Instead, help them to find their own motivation to change. There are a couple of articles I linked to on my resource page. There's one called The Science of Reasoning with Unreasonable People, How to Change People's Minds, The Art of Debunking, and it has useful communication techniques to communicate with people who you might be trying to help them broaden their perspective. It's been helpful in dealing with students and family and friends over the past year.
And here we have research, and we know that there are some elements of research and that tell us that some things don't work. For instance, arguing.
Attacking doesn't work.
Preaching.
And debating, because people just defend their own position.
So what works? Maybe asking open-ended questions.
Listening carefully, it shows respect.
Asking how would it work?
Looking for multiple answers. There's not just one answer.
Or even just simply stating the facts.
And identifying misconceptions. The problem with arguing, attacking, preaching, debating is that people shut down and they defend their own position rather than trying to change their point of view.
Thinking about diversity requires critical thinking. Here are some topics we share with our students. Fallacies in reasoning, the scientific method, and cognitive biases.
We begin the discussion by helping students recognize some of these fallacies in reasoning. Politics and advertising provide good examples. An example of appeal to authority is purchasing sneakers and breakfast cereal based on recommendations from our favorite athletes.
Here's an example of slippery slope that we often use with our students. If I fail the test, I will fail the course. If I fail the course, I will drop out of college. If I drop out of college, I won't get a good job. If I don't get a good job, I will be homeless. One event does not necessarily lead to the next one.
So after presenting these fallacies in reasoning, one assignment I give to students is to look at advertising and politics and bring in some examples of these fallacies in reasoning. One of the topics in the news recently is trust or lack of trust in science. It's helpful to understand some of the basics of the scientific method. First, we ask a question. Then we do some research to find out about the topic. Next, we form the hypothesis or educated guess. Then we design an experiment to test our hypothesis. Then we record observations and analyze the data. Lastly, we accept or reject our hypothesis based on the data. And when the data changes, then we might change our conclusion. I think people are having a hard time understanding that concept.
Note, this has nothing to do with politics. It enables us to fly a drone on Mars. Cognitive biases are systematic errors in thinking that are shortcuts the brain makes to quickly make sense of what's happening in the world. Cognitive biases can result in prejudice and discrimination.
Here's some examples of some cognitive biases. The first example is the Dunning-Kruger effect that states that the less you know, the more you think you know. And the opposite is actually true too. The more you know, the less you think you know.
Another example is confirmation bias. During the pandemic, we have seen many people follow the evidence that confirms their beliefs.
And you've seen some of these other biases in the news recently and in discussion of current events. Here's some examples from our textbook of current social issues that can be used for critical thinking exercises. One is equality for women.
Another is Black Lives Matter.
Another is Native Americans and Christopher Columbus.
And the Southwest border and immigration.
And another is LGBTQ+. So these are some examples in our textbook. When you are working on critical thinking with students, you can use any current issues in the news at the time.
Recently on 60 Minutes, there was some information about StoryCorps, an effort to record personal history. A new program is called One Small Step. It is an experiment using contact theory to bring together people with different points of view. It is based on the premise that people can use understanding and reduce division through face-to-face conversations.
Here are some conditions that help the process to be successful. Equal group status,
Common goals,
intergroup cooperation,
authority support,
friendship potential. Can I make a friend with someone who is different from me?
and how can we create these conditions in an FYE course?
And by the way, there is an article on contact theory in the resources for today at my website. This is a group exercise that I have successfully used with students over the years. The resources contain a handout for students to practice these critical thinking steps. I often choose a current article in the news, and some of the issues in our new chapter provide good materials for practicing the critical thinking process. So I'm going to walk you through the exercise that I do with my students. This is something that you could do with your students. And again, there's a handout on my resource page.
Here is an example from our current social issues section of the textbook. The first step is stating the problem in a clear way. Here's a clear problem statement. Native Americans have been advocating for the removal of statues of Christopher Columbus.
The next step is identifying alternative views. Students can be actively engaged by brainstorming ideas on both sides of the issue. This step fosters inclusion since all points of view are represented. It's a powerful way to increase awareness of different points of view. Of course, civil discourse is important. This involves respectfully listening to all sides and withholding judgment. And this is the hard part. We have to trust in the group process.
The history of Americas did not begin with Christopher Columbus. Native Americans viewed Christopher Columbus as an invader who enslaved Native people and treated them with violence and brutality. Beginning of genocide of Native people in which 90% of the Native population was decimated.
So that's one side of the issue. And then what is the other side of the issue? So here's what we might hear from students who maybe have some more traditional views. Celebrating Christopher Columbus is part of our tradition and culture, and taking down statues is a result of cancel culture.
Part of the exercise includes reviewing fallacies in reasoning and cognitive biases. During the discussion, encourage students to use critical thinking to identify fallacies and biases. In this case, some of the arguments are examples of appeal to tradition and maintaining the status quo.
An important part of the decision-making process is identifying your values, or what is most important to you. A previous chapter helps students understand their values. It is best to identify these values before the exercise. We can find common ground by sharing values. What's an important value for you? Maybe you could write some of your responses in the window. While you're thinking about that, maybe Seth and I can talk about some of our important values. I grew up and went to college during the Vietnam era, and that was supposed to be the last war. And so I really value peace in the world and hope we can attain that one day. I also grew up during the time of nuclear testing. And so I value the environment. Are we going to be able to live in the world in the future? Sometimes if you can identify your values, you can find common ground with other people, even though your politics or your point of view might be different. So values are an important way to find some common ground. Seth, could you talk about a couple of your values?
You know, I was born with something called nephrotic syndrome, and it was a 95% mortality rate at the time. And so what I began to value after that, after getting better, was life. And one of the things, the elements I took from that was making sure that whatever I did it to the best of my ability. So I take the Boy Scout motto and a value in a sense of leaving something better than you have found it. That will be a value of mine. Thanks, Marcia.
And then when Seth talks about his values, then I can start talking about, oh, I used to be a Girl Scout leader. We have some common ground, which helps us to establish a friendship. So in the chat window, if you could share one of your important values. Megan, do we have any in the chat window?
We do. We've got some great ones here. I've got equality, fairness, peace, collaboration, diversity, ecology, compassion, courage, and curiosity.
Those are all great values. And I think that when we talk about those kinds of values, you can find other people who share those values and find some common ground, which is what we're attempting to do in this exercise.
As the last step in this exercise, perhaps challenge students to find at least 3 different answers from different points of view. Then have students take a few minutes to write down or write about their reasonable point of view and how it matches their values. Ask some students to share their reasonable point of view, perhaps in class.
One of my favorite techniques is the 1-minute paper. It's a good summary of this exercise where you write about what you learned that day. Then I ask students to underline their most important sentence and then ask for volunteers to share those sentences with others in the group. Last semester, I did this exercise actually in my online course, and here's a student comment at the end. I just didn't understand the issue. I learned something new today and now understand why Native Americans want to remove these statues. I now agree with them. So it's wonderful to see students understand a different perspective and change their point of view. You can find this exercise and some of my favorite ones at my resource page at College Success One.
Our newly revised chapter, Diversity and Social Issues, includes these topics: degrees of privilege,
social inequality, income and wealth, which have some important issue during the pandemic,
bias, stereotype, and prejudice,
and some basic vocabulary for understanding diversity.
Here is a brief overview of some current social issues. Again, our goal is not to push an agenda, but to try to present the issue with objective facts as much as possible and to identify misconceptions that get in the way of critical thinking. Our goal is to raise awareness and engage in dialogue in a non-threatening and respectful environment.
One of the options in our chapter is equality for women. These issues are described in a page and a half with just some facts that are helpful to begin the discussion. The first issue is equality for women. This is one of the areas of my interest since I did my dissertation on women in non-traditional careers.
And here's a quiz for you. Just think about the answer. You will see the answer on the next slide.
Women still earn just 82 cents for every $1 earned by men. In 1982, when I did my dissertation, it was 78 cents. So in the last 40 some years, we've only gained 4 cents. There are a variety of reasons for this. One is women choose majors that pay less. Can we encourage women to consider STEM careers? Female athletes are paid less than male athletes.
Here's an example of a female athlete, Megan Rapinoe. In the 2019 Women's World Cup Finals, when the final whistle blew and the US team stormed the field in celebration, thousands of fans chanted, "Equal pay, equal pay." Members of the women's soccer team earn significantly less than their male counterparts, despite the fact that their team has been more successful and more profitable. The women's team, for instance, has won 4 World Cup tournaments. The men's team has never won a World Cup. Black Lives Matter is one of the most current social issues. As you can see from this slide, we mentioned George Floyd, but it really didn't start with George Floyd. If we go back a few years to Trayvon Martin, after the Zimmerman verdict, and Mr. Zimmerman was cleared in Sanford, Florida, what essentially happened was Black Lives Matter began as a result of that verdict. And so today we see protests and we hear about BLM all over the news. So some of the research that we have gathered for this particular subchapter is that essentially the average protester is in his 30s. He is male, white, and makes about $150,000 a year. Today, youth are concerned with these issues, so this is one of the reasons why we have chosen it as a topic or subtext in our this particular chapter.
This is another current issue in the news. It is complex with no easy solutions. My hope is that people can find a way forward on this issue.
It is helpful to understand the historical background of these issues and in explaining the importance of things like Latinx and indigenous cultures in the Southwest. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848 took these states from Mexico: Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming.
The treaty included citizenship and the protection of property and civil rights for Mexicans and indigenous peoples living in this new territory. The terms of the treaty were ignored. Citizenship was delayed several decades, civil rights were abused, and land was taken away. Some of my Native American friends have been told to return to their country. This reflects a lack of understanding of history.
Misconceptions get in the way of understanding and moving forward on the issue.
One of the misconceptions is that immigrants commit violent crimes. And here stating the fact, only 1.76% of crimes by immigrants are felonies. 87% of crimes are immigration crimes.
Another misconception is that immigrants negatively impact the economy. I just read that undocumented immigrants in Texas pay at least $1.5 billion in property, sales, and excise taxes annually. A link to this article is on our resource page.
And we note that over 80% of foreign-born residents are self-employed business owners who boost the economy through paying business and income taxes. We all benefit from being more accepting of all types of diversity. College should be a safe place for all types of students to learn and have equal opportunity.
And discrimination against LGBTQ plus results in mental health issues, increased suicide, and loss of educational and economic opportunity.
These are just some of the issues that we have in our textbook. It was difficult as we were writing this chapter to select issues because there are so many issues out there. If you're working with your students, you can choose any current topic in the news, but we do have these issues and basic outlines of the facts and misconceptions, and just short sections in our chapter on diversity can be useful in starting a discussion. Here are some ways that we help students to appreciate diversity, and we are nearing the end of our time and want to make sure that we leave time for discussion. So maybe I'll just pause a few seconds and let you look through this list. Again, I would encourage you to think about your experience. Are there some problems that you're having in teaching diversity? Some questions about your teaching philosophy? Are there some things that you are doing that's working really well that you could share with the group? If you'd like to contact us, Seth?
My contact information here is Baptiste Consulting @.us, or you can send me an email at Seth, SETH, @BaptisteConsulting.us.
Okay, and I'll add Seth's email on my resource page as well. I forgot to put it on this slide. You can view the resources again at collegesuccess1.com. Remember to click on training notes. You can also send me an email at marsha@marshafreilich.com. You can order a copy of College and Career Success by sending me an email. If you send me an email, make sure to send me your home address so that we can send out the textbook to you.
And the new 9th edition of College and Career Success contains 2 newly updated chapters: critical thinking, diversity, and social issues.
The textbook has a career emphasis to help students match their personal strengths with a major and career, as well as the traditional college success topics such as motivation, time management, study skills, and lifelong success topics. It's available in print and interactive digital media options. Directions for ordering a complimentary review copy are located at my resource page at College Success One, or my email, marsha@marshafreilich.com.
And I'd like to thank our wonderful moderator, Megan Peterman, and also the co-host, Dr. Marsha Freilich, and you for attending today's webinar.
Yes, thanks for attending today. We hope we've presented some useful information. We appreciate your questions and have reserved 15 minutes to share ideas. Please write your comments and questions in the chat window. We'll pause at this point, and I will go back and put our contact slide up again while you're thinking about it.
Before we get to questions specifically, we've had a couple of really excellent comments that I just want to make sure get their due credit. Carolyn was mentioning earlier that equality can only be defined by the individual or culture group that sets the boundaries for the definition. Each group defines equality by their own set of values and experiences.
That's a great comment.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Helen says, Carolyn's point also underlines the importance of including everyone in the collaboration and listening to one another. Well-meaning people can still miss the mark on how to achieve equality. I feel like we see this all the time.
Yes.
Yes. And our FYE classroom is an opportunity to encourage civil discourse and discussing the issues so that we can view different perspectives.
When discussing the issue of women's equality earlier and talking about how we can encourage women to enter STEM fields to help close that pay gap, Leslie also mentioned valuing as a society things traditionally associated as being women's work, things like education and social services. So placing an increased value on those things as well.
I get chill bumps with that one, yeah, because that's a lot of the work that I currently do with Rice University, NASA here in Houston. So getting girls interested in those STEM fields is critical. And Dr. Tapia at Rice University actually has been doing some research with Girl Tech, Teacher Tech to see why that is. Why are so many girls leaving the STEM fields after they leave middle school? For instance, computer science courses are given to them in these middle school classes, but they show disinterest when they get to high school. And so there are some things that are being done to encourage girls to stick it out. There's some research, double-blind study where girls actually make better websites than boys. Sorry, boys. But so there are some things being done to keep girls interested in those fields and also to pursue those fields as well.
I think that's an important topic, Seth. I'd like to talk a little bit about the opposite side of the coin, which I think maybe our commentator was talking about, and that is to value traditional women's careers. For example, teachers. We've seen during the pandemic that teachers have had to work really hard. A lot of them are burned out. Yesterday in the news, it said 56% of teachers are thinking about leaving the field. Also, nursing is another traditionally women's occupation. And again, people are thinking about leaving the field. This actually might be a good move because if people leave the field, then it'll be more valued and maybe paid better. So that may be one of the natural things that's happening as a result of the pandemic, which may make women's work more valued. Traditionally, women's work more valued. But growing up during the 60s, women often had to choose between being a teacher, a secretary, or a nurse. I chose to be a teacher. That's worked out well for me. But I do think I was limited because I didn't know what an engineer was. I was good at math. I was in the math club, but it never occurred to me to think about engineering as a career. And now that I do career assessments with my students, and I've taken these assessments myself, as it turns out, my personality, my personal strengths match those of an engineer. So what I would like to do is have students look at their personal strengths and choose their career based on their personal strengths and not on what is traditional for a man or traditional for a woman. That's one of my goals.
Or the opposite of that, what is non-traditional and what is not non-traditional. So that's a very important topic, very useful in today's FYE classroom.
Absolutely. Jumping into questions here and kind of conundrums in sort of teaching these classes on a regular basis. Leslie says, my course is designed by others, so I have limits on the material, time, and general content. But I work to incorporate JEDI, J-E-D-I, into all of the topics that I can.
Yes, I think some of us are limited by our student learning outcomes. You may not have a student learning outcome that has diversity and critical thinking, but I think the way we approach our class is important. For the orientation on all my courses, I talk about how important it is to have civil discourse in my class. That means listening to other people. If you disagree with a point of view, stating your opinion, but not attacking other people. And there will be times when these topics arise in the classroom, and how we deal with these topics, I think, is really important. So looking at the research on what works and what doesn't work, these controversial topics of today are going to leak into your classroom, whether it's part of your student learning outcomes or not. And so I think we all need to be prepared to deal with these. This is a perfect learning moment as things are happening in the world that students care about and are concerned about, that even though it's not a student learning outcome, you will find yourself discussing this topic in your classroom.
And perhaps something to add to that, and this might be a little more of a challenge for adjunct faculty, but that is get with the committee, perhaps, who is making the outcomes or who's putting together the outcomes for the course, and see if there is a possibility of adding a diversity component, if that's the issue you're referring to, a critical thinking component to the course. Perhaps doing that might help.
I think that's a great point, Seth.
All right, another question we have in the chat here, it's a pretty big one, is how do you address the concerns of those opposed to critical race theory?
We did this seminar yesterday and I brought up this topic, and I am concerned about what's happening now because critical race theory is being used as an excuse to censor different books, to not allow talking about certain points in history. And I always try to listen to the opposite point of view. And so what I think has happened is that critical race theory is a reaction to maybe in the past making people feel uncomfortable about the discussion. And so I think it's not about making people feel uncomfortable. It's about being objective, looking at the history, helping people increase their understanding. And very importantly, I think it is respecting and listening to different points of view and trusting the group process. When you get a group of people together with different perspectives, sharing their values, then people can understand and make friends with people in different points of view. I am listening and looking at what's happening with this discussion on critical race theory with some alarm, especially as textbooks or novels are being deleted from libraries. So I'm concerned about that. So in writing materials, I've always tried to respect everyone, not make anyone feel uncomfortable. I think one of the topics that makes people feel uncomfortable is privilege, the concept of privilege. So rather than talking about privilege as a way of making people uncomfortable, we all have different degrees of privilege. And how do you face challenges? Even though you might have some challenges, how do you overcome those? And those are the emphasis that I'd like to stress in my materials. And I know Seth has some ideas on this too.
Well, as an administrator and as faculty, I believe strongly in faculty teaching freedom, the freedom to teach what they need to teach in the classrooms. It's important that students learn and people feel comfortable with the content in which they teach. That being said, policy is kind of at the heart here. From a policy perspective and critical race theory, I would challenge the leadership of any community, any entity, any organization to define critical race theory in their own terms. What is it? I think I've asked many local leaders how they define it, and I don't think I've ever come across the same response. So it's a very broad topic. We really don't know. We just know it's critical race theory. And so I think defining that and then working with that, with how that's operational, as researchers, we want to operationally define something so that we can see if that's exactly what's happening. And so I think that's really important because we're banning, in some cases, I'm hearing the banning of some very prominent authors on both on both sides of the issue. People are kind of awestruck that is what just happened. So I think defining it is important, having a common ground, and then moving forward from there. It's hard to hit a moving target that seems to be big, small, and then moving here and there and changing colors.
And we do know that critical race theory is actually something that usually isn't taught in elementary, middle, high school. It's something that's taught maybe in upper level college courses. So I think it's just a label that's being used to justify limiting education. So I'm a little concerned about that. And I think whatever we can do to make people comfortable with talking about differences, diversity, and using critical thinking, that helps to get rid of this problem or make it a little bit less.
Absolutely. And this is kind of while we're on the topic, when you're dealing with a situation where CRT has been banned, how do you create those opportunities for constructive discussion? I feel like you were just addressing this, Dr. Freilich, of just making sure that people feel comfortable with opening discussions about differences.
Well, I would just emphasize again, in my classroom, I don't think anyone could criticize me for using critical race theory. I respect all points of view. I listen to other people. I trust the group process. I think my results are that people increase critical thinking and understanding. So I'm confident that if someone looked at my classroom, I couldn't be criticized for using critical race theory. But
Mhm.
I am passionate about sharing history, sharing the facts. I grew up in New Mexico, and I was just talking with my best friend the other day. We were not taught about all the Indian pueblos that were between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and they were all Indian pueblos. We were taught about the Spanish conquistadores, and we were not taught about Native American culture. Now things are changing, and that's so important that we get the history right. We've been taught our history from a point of view that has been not very inclusive. So I am passionate about that.
Rohini has a great response to this conversation. Universities are spaces where having comfortably uncomfortable conversations fuels change and growth. I often self-identify immediately on the first day of class so students can see who I am and that the message of the medium. As a racialized woman scholar, I feel this is important for students to know academic spaces have long forgotten that people like me belong. So if I belong now, at least in some spaces, they belong too.
Very
Perfect.
nice.
Mhm.
So I think it's important that we have faculty that represent the diversity that our students bring to campuses. I'm happy that, for example, President Biden has pledged to hire an African-American woman for the Supreme Court. I think it's long overdue. And I know some people are criticizing that, saying, oh, it's affirmative action. But I think we need to have diverse representatives in schools and in our courts and our politics so that people have a feeling of belonging, so that when students go to college, they can say, yes, I belong here.
Carolyn has some great comments. Something that has been working very well for their classroom is understand yourself and your own culture in order to be free to accept, not necessarily agree with, and understand the differences of others. There is not any theory or idea that others will always support. So teaching students to agree to disagree and understand all views, have strengths and weaknesses, that is what makes diversity.
We have a really good assignment that we've been doing for probably 20, 30 years now. It's called the Diversity Collage. And so toward the end of the semester, we have students do a poster that represents their culture. And we invite them to bring food from their culture. And in our area of San Diego, there are lots of Middle Eastern students. So the Middle Eastern students bring in the Middle Eastern food. We have lots of indigenous students, so they'll bring in their cuisine. We have Mexican students, so they'll bring in their cuisine. So it's a celebration. Food brings everybody together, and everyone talks about pride in their culture. And then they know, I think it's important to respect other cultures. And so that assignment's also on our resource page. Seth, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think you said it all. Having that as an international teacher, because of course I taught English, I also taught international students in our ESOL program. And each semester we would have a day where students would do exactly that, bring in something from their culture, and then we would all eat it, and all things were great. And I think our military, as having a family that's with military participants and that have gone abroad for our country, I know that something that is done, at least according to the story from my Marine Corps uncle, is making sure you eat the food of folks in the community in which you are patrolling, for instance. That's been very important to them to do that as a way of showing friendliness and not just showing a sign of disrespect in those particular cultures. So yes, I definitely agree that eating, quickest way to a man's heart is that tummy, and also through a cultural aspect as well.
Yeah, in our classrooms, when we would do this, some of the parents were so excited about we were celebrating their culture that the mothers would bring in these trays of beautiful food. It was just amazing. And they were showing pride in their culture, and our students were able to understand the different culture and appreciate it. So a powerful exercise.
All right. Do we have any other questions today? Lots of echoing of people who have visited Chaco Canyon and talking about understanding the complexity of Pueblo beliefs, how it shows the interconnectedness of the First Nations and understanding America before the conquest. So lots of echoing with those thoughts.
I would just like to add, in high school, we were taught that pretty much American history started with 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But that's not the case. There was a well-developed society in all of the Americas. And so we need to change how we teach history. History is taught from the point of view of the colonizers and not the native people. So that's an area of interest for me. It always has been all my whole life.
All right. Well, that looks like it does it for questions for us today. But we want to thank you everyone again so much for attending. We hope that you gleaned some wonderful things from our presenters today. Following this webinar, you will be provided in the coming days with webinar resources as well as the recording. But thank you again for attending. Thank you to our presenters, Dr. Marcia Freilich and Dr. Seth Batiste, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.
Yes, thanks for attending. Have a great day.